I'm the events officer on the Provincial Council, so do speak to me if you need any help with the organisational aspect of today. This is Margaret, our president, and there's other members of Provincial Council around. Give us a wave. So do speak to any of us informally. We've got the AGM this afternoon, but also if you'd like to discuss anything to do with what Provincial Council are doing or what's going on in the province, do just speak to us. And we hope that today is an opportunity as well to make friends and networks with each other. So speak to anyone, but we've identified ourselves so that if you have anything that you'd like to discuss in particular, we're here. Fire exits, I hope we won't need them, but just in case, you can go out by any... This one isn't open, is it? You can go out by the one door and meet outside the front of the church, should you need to. Yes, I hope it won't be needed, but basically there is only that one exit, so just go that way, and if that's blocked, I'm lucky. I'm sure another opportunity will present itself. The toilets, I think most of you have found, are towards the place where we were having tea and coffee, so through the double doors and then on your right. We have scheduled break times. There's a timetable up here and in all the other rooms, so the next break will be after Father Cristóbal's talk. But obviously we're all adults, so if you need to go, if you need to pop out, then you don't need to put your hand up. So just go when you need. If you do need to use the lift, then please do let someone know, because sometimes that malfunctions. So it's good if there's always someone outside the lift who knows that it's in the lift. Yeah, that's happening. We will, at 12 o'clock, have the Office of Readings and Midday Prayer. Please, if you would like to volunteer to read at that, if you'd be one of the longer or shorter readers, then if you could just come and get me during the tea or coffee break and we'll sort that out, that'd be great. Thank you. And lastly, please, just a reminder to switch off phones, put them on silent. Someone next to you probably can help you if you don't know how to do that. If you're a doctor on call and you really, really can't switch it off, then please maybe hover around the exit, so just to be polite. But I'm sure that we can all... Oh, look, someone's ringing me now. And they probably want to get in this door. So I'm sure we'll be able to manage it. Anything else, practical-wise? Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Margaret, who will introduce Father Cristóbal to you.
And just as I said no there, I remembered one of the things Teresa's already mentioned, that we're recording Father Cristóbal's talk to go on our YouTube channel, and we're recording the AGM this afternoon purely for the purpose of taking the minutes. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, and those of you who've been to a few of these events will know, I'm going to be wandering around with my camera. So if you don't want your photo on our website, please let me know, and I'll make sure that that we don't publish photographs. So, we meet every year at our assembly, and obviously the Provincial Council will sit down and think, who shall we invite to talk to us? What shall our subject be this year? But one of the interesting things about this year's assembly is that at the same time we were talking about the fact that we get together on these occasions, and I always think there's a real blessing when we all come together. But we have so much to talk about, we never have enough time in the day. And we have some really big issues that are worth spending the time talking about. So we had the idea that as well as our annual assembly, it would be good to have a chapter and have more time to talk about some really big subjects. So that's something that we're planning for June or July next year. And we were considering what would be those big subjects that we would talk about at our chapter. And one or two of them were really obvious. We've got lots of issues worth exploring about community, what it means to be community for lay Dominicans. We've got a really big important piece of work ongoing on getting our directory in shape and revised. And I had a Zoom call with an open invitation for people to come and talk about this idea of a chapter. And on that call there was a really important suggestion from somebody who's sitting in this room, but I won't embarrass him by saying his name. He said we need to talk about mission and we need to talk about what our apostolate is. So I went away from that call and thought, that's right, but where do you start? It's such a big subject that there were no obvious questions occurring to me about how we would start a discussion on that. But providentially, just within days of us having that conversation, a letter was published from Father Gerard, the Master of the Order, based on the documents that were being put together for the General Chapter of the Friars, but with a really clear message in it that this has interest for the whole of the Dominican family. It's not just addressed to the Friars. And it was about our preaching and the four publics of our preaching. So that's a really clear thing that we need to spend considerable time and give a lot of attention to discussing how this applies to us. So we're very lucky to have with us today Father Cristóbal, who is the promoter of the laity for the entire order. So he's based in Rome, but he travels the world, and maybe will tell us a little bit about that, and about how what he sees from lay Dominican communities in different countries, and about how all of us are addressing this idea of what our apostolate looks like, what our preaching looks like, and particularly in the light of what the Master has said in this letter to us. So, without further ado, Cristóbal.
Thank you so much. So, I thought I'd begin. I didn't originally intend to begin this way, but I think I will. The wallpaper that I have on my very messy desktop is actually an image from, so one of the brothers in my province, I belong to the province of St. Martin de Porres, which is the southern province in the United States. And one of the brothers there, Father Mark Wiedig, he's currently the president, has been for the past few years, of Aquinas Institute of Theology, which is our studium, where our student brothers study. And he did some research a few years ago for an article he was working on about the use of architecture and art and the spaces, the way that the Spanish friars used that when they were in New Spain, what is today, particularly southern Mexico today. And so he went to Oaxaca and some places down there, and I just saw Father Matthew. Good to see you. This warms my heart. So anyway, he went down there and did some on-site research, and he took some pictures, and this was one of them, and it was basically how they used both the internal and external spaces, both the inside of the churches that they were building and also the outside spaces of the churches, because the indigenous communities that they were working with were used to worshiping out in nature. So they kind of made the outside of the church part of the evangelization and the liturgical life of that community, which made a lot of sense. You know, it was enculturation before the word was being used, right? So anyway, this particular image I love because, I don't know, it just warms my heart. A representation of the deposition, a motif that's been done throughout the history of Christian art, but you see Dominican friars taking the Lord down from the cross. And I love the tenderness, It's not at all a miserable image. There's a tenderness, there's a care, there's a love. The care with which they are taking the Lord down and so on, I think is just, for me, is very special. But I share it because I just think it's a very cool image, but also because when we're talking about the four publics and how our preaching reaches, it's also good to look. This isn't going to be a historical lecture or anything like that, but it is interesting to look at our order's history and how we've done that, in the past, how we've reached out and sort of taken into consideration how we have, and these are themes that will come up here, listening, which ties in very well with the theme of synodality that we have in our church today, and which is actually a very ancient theme, it's not just today, but listening to the context that we're moving in, both intra-ecclesially and extra, right? And then how our approach to mission sort of flows out of that, and obviously out of our prayer and our relationship with the Lord, right? So anyway, I wanted to share that with you because I think that's a very nice concrete example of what that looked like in a particular time and place in history of the illustrious history of our order. So let's begin. This particular theme, when I remember when I was talking with Margaret about what might be some useful focus or things that we might talk about, and she mentioned maybe carrying some of what was discussed in the chapter in terms of, and then how to look at interacting with those four publics as lay Dominicans, and within the broader context of as an order, as the order of preachers. I would say that my own experience working in the order, and something that I know Father Matthew can attest to as well, I'm sure, is we've had the good fortune over the course of the years to be able to serve as interpreters in general chapters. And one of the things that when attending these international gatherings, and of course there's the International Assembly of the Laity as well, right, is that these are opportunities to sort of engage. It's intra-ecclesial, obviously, but we're still in a sense dealing with different publics in a different way, because there are different cultural contexts. And the church, the local church, looks very different sometimes from one place to the next. Ecclesiologies can be a little bit different. The local politics can be a bit different. The things that are valued, the things that are prioritized in the mission, and so on, can be quite different. And sometimes we need translators to talk to each other. And I don't just mean in terms of, this one's speaking French and this one's speaking English, but even in terms of just our perspectives and where we're coming from, even when we're speaking the same language. So some of these things, these are transferable skills that will serve us well, not only in dealing with different ministerial contexts, but living with one another, and communicating with one another as fellow Catholics, as fellow Dominicans, and so forth, or even laity and sisters and friars and nuns and so forth, So the first thing is this little slide, which I did not create, but I decided to pilfer and use because it's very useful, was created for us, at the level of the Curia, to sort of talk about the themes covered in the Master's Relatio and covered in the chapter. And of course, it's one of those that, it's animated. So, see, we can make things disappear. Such power. So the purpose of the order, you start at the top, the purpose of the order here and now, right? This is carried out in harmony with the Church's mission of the new evangelization addressed to four publics, the persons to whom our preaching is addressed. Now, you may remember or not from the Relatio that over the past few general chapters, the focus has been very much about restructuring. That's been a theme that's come up a lot. So it's sort of like the order looking internally at itself and saying, okay, so we have these general vicariates and we have, just different kind of, you could say, political realities and stuff in the order. What doesn't make sense anymore? How do we streamline? How do we do things better? But then this chapter, what the Master was thinking was, okay, the structures are important, but why do we have them? It's to serve and support the mission, which is something that also came up in the car on the way over here. There's a reason that we have, whether it's the lay Dominican rule or the fundamental constitutions or what have you. It's about supporting our community life and our preaching, right? So he wanted to kind of shift, okay, now we've had this restructuring, how do we then go out from here and pay attention to the people that we're engaging with? So that's where this comes from. So the first group mentioned, of course, which would make sense, in medio ecclesiae. So basically, we're dealing. Well, before we get to the groups, we're preaching from the heart of the church, and of course, our consecration and every element of our life is in service to the preaching. We're basically, we exist for that. So the first group, the first public, would be the Christian faithful themselves. So it's that intra-ecclesial reality. So basically, it's how do we continue to refresh and sort of witness the gospel to one another? both basically in the pews and so forth, to one another in our common life and so forth. And then we have people on the margins of the church, people who are maybe lapsed or disillusioned Catholics, people who have felt very badly hurt by the church, or who feel that they don't have a place, that they'll never have a place. Situations that maybe don't have an easy solution, or that maybe there won't be a definitive answer maybe for another few generations or something. But, people need Jesus now, right? And so how do we do this? How do we walk with one another? Okay, so that's another public, very important. Gentes, that term was used a lot. Persons in the different Areopagi of the world, right? Referring to St. Paul and the famous speech that he gave, the preaching that he gave at the Areopagus, right? And so basically it's how do we reach out to the various different sort of contexts in our world outside of the church, but that maybe have the seeds of the gospel in them in different ways. And that, of course, that's been there from the beginning. And, of course, there was one particular public, young people found in other publics. One thing that I have found interesting since beginning my Dominican life that I was not as conscious of before I entered the order, is to see the growth and the development over the years, the focus on ministering to young people, which of course is just common sense. It just makes sense, particularly in a world that's increasingly certainly in countries like the ones that we live in here, in the UK and in the US and different parts of Western Europe, where secularism is more becoming stronger. And there are many unchurched and new generations, maybe who just don't know, but they might be searching. So how to reach young people. So I know, for example, in the United States, there's been a big focus in the American provinces on what is termed there, the term that's used there is campus ministry, which is basically like university chaplaincy and things like that. And of course, there's a practical side to it in the sense that it's also, there's a vocation side to it, but it's really, at the core, it's engaging the spiritual hungers of young people, right? And how to do that in a way that makes sense and to engage them. So those are the four publics. And basically, how do we do this? And how do we sort of orient ourselves outward? So one thing is that, I think a couple of things that I wanted to mention that came up in the chapter itself, in the final document. By the way, whenever I quote the acta, some of it, so just to explain, because I don't think we have, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think we have the definitive translation yet, right? I think we're still waiting for it. So the way it usually works, just so you know, there are commissions at every general chapter that have to work on discussing particular things, like government and economics, or mission and things like that. And so, depending on the linguistic makeup of that commission, then that is the language in which the document is written, and it has to be one of the three official languages of the order. So it's going to be either English, Spanish, or French. So what happens is we have the acta at this time, but we don't have it fully translated yet. That's being worked on. So the one we have, the chapter that was done by Commission X is in English. The one by Commission Y is in Spanish, and so on. So what I did was, sometimes you're going to be looking at the original if it was in English. Other times, just for expediency's sake, we're talking about AI, I just put it through ChatGPT, and so it may have originally been in English, or it may not, what I'm going to be sharing with you here. Okay, even though I translate, I was too lazy. So, so anyway, this is number 68 in the document of the Acts of the chapter. So one of the reason I picked this particular quote, speaking of mission, was in itself a challenge. This was, I believe, I think it was in the prologue, I don't remember right now. For to evoke this vast field, whose breadth was represented by the capitulars coming from the four corners of the world, requires acknowledging its immense diversity and the work of enculturation that preaching necessarily entails. One might therefore have undertaken a reflection according to cultural or linguistic areas. But the chapter chose instead to treat this mission as a single reality, the very object of our order, itself considered in its uniqueness. So I think something that always has to be considered whenever we talk about mission, whether you're focusing on the uniqueness and the unicity of the mission, or you're looking at how to make that relevant to the different groups that you're dealing with, you always have to deal with enculturation. It's unavoidable. You have to. And enculturation, as we know, I think, does not just mean, I don't know, like, oh, we're working with a community from Nigeria, or we're working with a community from Peru or something. There certainly is that. But it's also the fact that, you take, I'm sure here in the UK, you take a particular parish, and let's say they're all English, in a particular place, and there are no immigrants in that parish, and then you take another parish of a similar ethnic makeup, cultural makeup, but they might have very different politics. They might have very different understandings and visions of what the church is and should be. That's an intercultural conversation in a certain sense. And there's a way in which, if you're going to interact at that level, there's also a way in which we have to kind of translate, in order to interact with each other and be with each other. So I think, enculturation has many facets, and I think that came up a little bit, to my mind, and I think we have to be conscious of the contexts in which we're working. Certainly that's very evident in the four publics. The four publics is a concept that is inherently contextual, It's not the same dealing with someone who's in the flock and they're committed for life, and whether they like this or that or they don't like it, they're in it for life, they ain't going anywhere. Versus someone who's like, I'm not going in there, they don't want me. It's very different publics, So, Christian faithful. Now, it was interesting for me picking images because, whatever images you pick, they say different things. So, what represents Christian faithful? So I picked a very specific moment, very specific community. And so this was a lay Dominican, a couple of lay fraternities in my province of St. Martin de Porres in the United States. And they just recently celebrated and they invited me to preside. It was a mass of profession. You had some who were being simply professed. Among them, I'm proud to say my sister, Maria, who's right there. She took Edith Stein as her saint. So you've got, you have this. It was in Miami. The context of these Christian faithful, you have probably ecclesiologically people from different points, probably a little more on the classical side, right? But you had. But it's pretty diverse, and so that's one face of the Christian faithful. I could have just as easily picked pictures from other visits I've done to other places that look extraordinarily different from this, right? So even working within the Christian faithful, again, context. The gentes, persons in the different areopagai in our world. I swiped this from the internet. Hopefully I don't have to ask permission. But it's a cool picture of one of those altars to the unknown God. Apparently, which I did not know this, there were several of them in the ancient world. I did not know this. The Pauline reference is actually, it wasn't a solitary thing. This one, I forget what it actually points to, except that it was in Rome, not in Greece. It was not it was rather in Rome, I believe. And I think there's an intuition, there's a seed that exists in the Christian tradition from the very beginning. And it's that sense of the presence that what Justin Martyr and so forth, when they talked about the seeds of the logos, the seeds of the word, present in the pagan philosophers, for example. That's the most classical articulation of that idea that we have. But there's a lot of work that's been done over the centuries and even today into that, engaging as the Catholic tradition, engages with other cultures and other parts of the world, other philosophical traditions, and Asia and different places, and African thought and so forth. How does our fundamental humanity and the way we're sort of programmed for God, and the religious instinct that's part of our human nature, how does it express itself? And also our natural reason and our shared experience through our various cultures and so on. How is the gospel in some sense already kind of present, How is Jesus already there waiting? And when we arrive in a context that seems to us to be completely foreign to what we would consider Christian or whatnot, including Westerners who maybe were brought up without being churched or without any exposure, to going to any kind of church growing up. How is Jesus already there waiting for us? And how is it that when the gospel is shared, we're also, in a sense, converted? Because maybe they have something that we're missing, right? And that helps us. We have it, but we just can't see it because we're sort of blinded to it. But because they don't have the baggage anymore, or they never had it, maybe they see something that we don't, or that we should see. So there's a way in which conversion, the whole process of evangelization, it should evangelize all of us in a certain sense. In the Relatio, and this is also quoting from the Acts, in his Relatio, the master of the order reminds us that the place of mission is no longer only far from home, it is also close to home. Again, right? This keeps coming up. The chapter reaffirms the importance and priority of both forms of mission ad gentes. Okay? That's just a declaratio, which means it's just saying something, that's just reminding everybody, right? Like declaring. And then another declaratio. This mission involves reaching out both to those who have never encountered Christ and to those shaped by a cultural Christianity in which the image of Jesus is often distorted. Yet both are part of the same mission, to proclaim Christ as Savior beyond historical or cultural boundaries. Okay? So that's the thing, that there's the universality and the particularity. The message in one sense is universal, but it cannot reach that. It can't really show that if it doesn't somehow know how to grapple with the cultural particularity. We're saved through the incarnation. Jesus chooses, God chooses to incarnate as a particular type of human being in a certain culture, speaks a certain language in a particular century in a certain part of the world, but the effects are universal. It's kind of an interesting paradox, right? Okay, so young people who are found in the other publics. I just included this because that's Christina. She's from, she was the representative of Edim in the IDYM in the chapter. So she was on that commission. She's from the Spanish province, and she's like that. She's really cool. Anyway, so I had to put her in there. But yes, so young people found in the other publics. And this is something that I think we're going to find that the data is going to keep changing. The experience will keep changing with new generations. I think when I entered the order, I had certain ideas about what youth ministry was. And then and then in the time that I've been in the order, and I've only been in the order for about, how long has it been? 16 years, I guess. And the thing that I have found is that it's changed already in 16 years in significant ways. So some of the stereotypes that I had in my head about some of the younger people, because they were based on, I'm what they call Generation X, the Gen X or whatever. I assume in the UK they might use that terminology. I don't know. They do, right? Yeah. So Gen X. So the idea being that somehow the people who came right after the boomers, that there was this sort of rejection of Christianity, that there's we've known it and we just don't like it, or we were brought up sort of on the margins of it and it's sort of we're kind of past that or something. And yet what I found when I was ordained and then I was suddenly in a university environment and stuff was, in reality, you did have some of that. But I think there was, because now it was the next generation after that, and it was more just indifference. It wasn't that there was animosity. It was more we just don't know what this is, But not necessarily all the way across, because I remember at Barry, for instance, that was a very interesting environment. We had a lot of young people who were from backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, where they were still closer to the faith. So for example, for students who were either from the Caribbean or from Latin America or who were African American, they tended to have more, like the faith had more of a role, if they were Catholic, had more of a place in their lives, or if they were Protestant. They had a sense whether they went to church or not, they might not have been churchgoers or they may have been, but the Lord was real and you had to be with the Lord. You know, there was sort of more like that. But you also had young people who maybe grew up where that was alien, and so they had no animosity. It was like talking about some strange exotic thing that they just never knew. But one thing that was common was there was a spiritual hunger in general. So whether they had this pathway established through which they could access it, but maybe they might have an ambiguous relationship with it, or they just didn't have a pathway and they were trying to find a way. For the most part, there was a sense of a thirst for transcendence and a desire for God, for something, for spirituality. So that was interesting. And again, those are very different contexts. Even if they all share the hunger, how you reach one is different from how you reach the other. Okay. So, and I think this is going to continue to evolve. People talk also about the turn, and you see it reflected in the last 15 years or so, in vocations to religious orders, sort of leaning more, trying to recover some of the traditions and so on. That's true, but it's more complex than that. And I want to emphasize this. There's a great deal of complexity in all of these phenomena. And so we tend to be very reductive in our thinking, but it doesn't, it's like, just because somebody likes guitar mass doesn't mean that their theological thinking is a particular way. Or that they might like more Latin in their liturgy, but they might be very liberal in other, it doesn't always align exactly. We have to kind of learn to look past those surfaces, which we'll get to, because that's how do you do the mission, right? But I think it's important to at least know that going in. It's a necessary social skill we've evolved, for survival, that we learn to identify surface information to help us navigate social spaces. Who do I talk to first? Who do I stay away from? Can I trust you? Can I not trust you? So we look at those codes, but the problem is that's fine if you're in a very fast, very discrete sort of interaction, especially if it's survival related, but once you're getting into deeper building community, we have to sort of thwart that programming a little bit because it keeps us separate and in very bad ways. So people on the margins of the church. This image, I was trying to find a good image and it was just like hard to find one that wasn't either too schmaltzy or too, whatever. So I just thought, I liked, because it ties into the next part of the presentation well, I think. I just picked an image from the Synod on Synodality on one of the sessions. Because I think this has a lot of what we need to look at in terms of engaging, and I'll get to why I say that in a minute. But there is a way in which, there are a lot of people who either they don't find that the faith speaks to them, maybe they don't find it credible because of and there are many reasons for this. Part of it is growing up in a post-Christian culture where, some of it is exposure to different ideological currents. Some years ago you had the thing of the new atheists and so forth, which was, I think now is we're kind of moving past that a little bit, I think. But the idea that some false ideas about Christian tradition, about the so-called spaghetti monster and things like that, that I think you can debunk them pretty well today. There's been a good response to that. So you have that sort of thing. You have also just some of the presuppositions about spirituality, some of which are maybe a little bit more Gnostic and so forth, that also impede sort of the believability of the kerygma, especially depending how the kerygma is presented and the way people experience and are exposed to Christianity, or have been exposed to it. And then you have the problem of what is the relationship between development of doctrine and the new situations that arise in people's lives, and then the ways that people are, so these are some of these, of course. You have the hot button issues that people get upset about and get very polarized over. And the thing is, some things you could say, well, some things can change, some things can't. Some things you can see that they may be able to, some you see they may not be able to. Some things we may not know for another 150 years, but we'll be dead by then. So, and yet people have to make choices and live their lives, so how do you navigate that? And so those are things that I think also are a big issue. Is it better to just let people stay away and not have exposure at all? Do you, how do you wrestle with this? And so there are many different possible ways to answer this question, but I think it has to be wrestled with. So I think an important component, not just for this, I put it after this one because I think it's especially important here, but I think it's important for all of them, really, for all of the publics, is in the document, it talks about a spirituality, in the Acts of the chapter, a spirituality of listening for the mission. And this is, I think, critical. In this general chapter, it was a theme that was very important. A spirituality of listening for the mission. And of course, this is perfectly aligned with what Pope Francis began, and now Pope Leo very emphatically is continuing with the concept of with continuing with synodality and with listening and so forth. And then the next phase of that synod, which is coming over the next 3 years. In its reflection on mission, the chapter had to acknowledge that talking about the friars in this case, but I think we can look at the church generally. The brothers of the order may also have been the cause of such estrangements. The way that we interact in those contexts can lead people to feel, I don't have a place here. And I've seen that happen. I can attest to it. That is why we chose to reflect at length on the methods of mission in today's context, noting that there can be no authentic preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the true heart of our mission, without listening to our contemporaries and their needs, following the example of Dominic the preacher conversing with the innkeeper of Toulouse. Now, before I go, let me stop there for a minute. So now, this is a difficult point, I find, because we want, even when we're open to listening, we want to rush to the answer right away. And that may not be possible right now. And so sometimes we have to be patient. Sometimes we may have to even be patient with the idea that we might be dead before the Christian community comes to a point where, whatever that outcome is, okay? Somebody may very well be in error. That's very possible, okay? But they're seeking in good conscience, and we want to encourage that seeking to continue. Somebody might not be in error, and the church needs to catch up with something. It's hard to always be able to distinguish when that's happening. Either way, we need to try to, we have the benchmarks, we have the things that we're given, we're moving toward that. And in the meantime, we're dealing with this messy reality, and we want to kind of keep together. I think Pope Leo is trying to sort of do that very much right now. But I think what I have learned in my experience, both within the order of friars living with friars, for example, where we can sometimes be in different places and different things. And we're different, when you live in a religious community, people don't always realize you have different personalities, independently of whatever one's politics or whatever, we have different personalities. And we live together. And so sometimes we get along fabulously. Sometimes, I remember one thing, and I think any friar here will probably attest to this. When I was a student brother, coming into the refectory, and at least the setup that we had in St. Louis, you had multiple tables. There weren't like any assigned, it's not like in the old days that you were assigned an order of religion or anything like that. So you could kind of choose where you were going to sit. And then you're going in, and you're tired, and you've had like a long day or whatever, and you've got your tray, and you're looking, and you're like, I don't want to sit next to him today because he's going to talk about that. And I'm like, I'd like to sit next to him, but his table's full. Like, and then you're kind of doing this like very quick mental calculus, trying to figure it out, and then hopefully your better angels will prevail. And sometimes you just need to sit with the one that you're comfortable sitting with because you can't handle it, and that's okay. Like there's a time for that too. You don't have to be super saint every day when it comes to that. But what you try to do gently is to push yourself to say, okay, I don't want to sit with him today, but I'm going to do it, and I'm going to make a choice about how I'm going to approach this. And he's my brother, and we're going to love one another in the concrete in the way that's appropriate right now, and you sit down. And then you listen and you try to talk, and if he talks about that, you try to decide how you're going to, how to engage productively or fruitfully, okay? So, but the thing that I find is, this has been one of the most enriching parts of my ability to grow, not just as a Dominican, but as a Christian, because it has trained me to be able to bridge gaps, and in the world we're living in right now, and I'm not just talking about the church, we all know, politically set in the secular world, people are willing to kill each other in some cases for different reasons, whether they're on one side or the other. So we have to be very mindful that we, as Dominican communities, that we're part of the solution, right? And the best way to do that is to do what Jesus did. And he kind of, he would get angry, he would get upset about things, and he would speak his mind. But he also knew how to bring different people to the table and how to sort of try to address things. So I think it's important for us to provide a forum where we have to begin by listening. And listening doesn't always mean we agree. And we can speak and say that we don't agree with something, But there's also a way, there's a time, there's a manner, and sometimes it is just shutting up and listening. Because sometimes, again, it's contextual. Sometimes that person, if you speak too soon, they're just going to go. So you want to just sort of let them just listen, just be there. And then over time, and another thing too, I think that I have found is important is building relationship. One of the reasons I think we've become so polarized in the world today is that, and then that affects mission, preaching to any public negatively, is that we don't have the patience to build relationship and be with one another before we touch on things that might be difficult for us to talk about, And sometimes you have to be able to also just know how to talk about your favorite TV show. Well, that's kind of anachronistic today, isn't it? Your favorite YouTuber, whatever it is, before you talk about something that might be a little bit more difficult, Because when I trust you, and at least I know that you love me and that you have my best interests at heart, I can take better when you say something that I might find difficult and that I might disagree with, and that I might not end up agreeing with you on. But at least I can receive it, and I can try to see it as best I can and try to understand why are you saying that? Why, or what's going on? Either what your experience is or what the church is teaching about something. And then the thing is, this is a very important skill. The other thing I wanted to say about this is that there's another piece to this. That's part of the spirituality of listening, but I'll get to that in the homily at Mass today. So I'm not going to really touch on it now, except to say that I think in mission, the first thing, and this is not an original thought, I'm not the first person to say this by any stretch of the imagination, but it's to cultivate, people have to fall in love with Christ. And they have to have some experience of the Spirit working in them. Because once that's there, and once you can't deny it or negotiate it away, it becomes an imperative. Now, we're always free to reject it, right? God makes us free. God is madly in love with us, but gives us the freedom to say, I don't want you, even for eternity, if that's what we choose, right? But the thing is, if I don't fall in love back, if I don't experience that love and fall in love back, I'm not going to listen to something that's really hard for me to deal with. It's not going to happen. So in a sense, a big part of mission is before, telling people what they ought to think, even if it's true, is cultivating that love relationship and letting that sort of lead the way. And in that process, again, the person in the public that you're dealing with may never get there to where you're thinking they should get, but they might still become a saint. You don't know that. You don't know that. Even if they're objectively wrong about something. Okay? So I think it's important that we be on the road, and that if at least we're seeking that, that's an important foundation. And then everything else can be built from there. And like I said, some things you'll see resolved in our lifetime, some we won't. But I think that's critically important. Now, that is enough for now about the four publics. What I'm going to do really quickly is I wanted to, if it's okay with you, shift gears a little bit. And I wanted to share a little bit about a couple of new things that are now available, hopefully as resources for the Dominican laity in the world, and that I think does tie in, because it can also help in terms of, at the end of the day, it helps us be better Dominicans, and it helps us to be formed for mission, right? So the first thing is, we just had, for the first time in 800 years, right, the Dominican laity have a ratio formationis et studiorum. And you might be wondering, what the heck is that? And why should it matter? So the ratio is a document that has existed for a long time for the friars. We have two actually global ones, and then the provinces have their own particular ones. But the general ones that applies to all friars everywhere. There's one for formation and one for studies. So it's very tied to formation and the intellectual life. So it's basically when a friar, whether he is in initial formation as a student brother, or whether he is in permanent formation until he goes home to God, what should be in the different life stages and stages of formation, what kind of material, what kind of formation should he be receiving, both intellectually, academically, as well as preparing him as a human being, right, to flourish as a Dominican friar. So these documents are sort of useful for us in helping them, each province, tailor that to their own particular context. Now in this case, this has never really existed for the laity before. This is quite an innovative thing. In this case, I'll tell you this, I've already said a little bit about the similarities, I'll also tell you about the differences here. So first of all, this is one document. It is not particular to every province. It's just one universal document. It's neither formation, formation generally speaking, nor the intellectual life. It kind of smushes them a little bit, which means it's not going to be a terribly complete thing. It also, one difference is that it is normative in the sense that it's approved by the master of the order. It was worked on by leadership in the Dominican laity, including one person who worked on it a lot recently with a commission of lay people from different parts of the world, was Sebastian Milazzo, the international coordinator, who's also a theologian and who teaches in Strasbourg, in the University of Strasbourg. One thing about this document, though, it's normative in that sense, but it's not meant to be juridically sort of to cage you in. So in other words, up until now, and it will continue to be the case, it will not change, every province should have its own formation program, right, which you will continue to follow. This is simply to point out that in different locations and in different contexts, the differences and the level of formation available and so forth can be very, very broad, very wide. The gaps can be pretty wide sometimes. So this is a way of offering a resource so that everybody can sort of be enriched, so that there can be some sense of benchmarks that can be sort of aspired to. But the idea is that at the end of the day, this needs to be sort of explored and then let's say, incorporated to the degree that according to the context and in the way that makes sense within your particular context. So you do not have to revamp your entire program to make it look slavishly like this. It's simply keep doing what you're doing, especially if it's working, but here you have some resources to help you enrich it, okay? And for those that have greater need, they have more resource maybe to help them if they do need to revamp everything. It includes a bibliography, and so it has source, and something I chose to do was because Sebastian had acquired sources in English and in French and in German, because there were a lot of good stuff available in German. And I found, with the help of the Spanish brothers, a good Spanish bibliography. But what I chose to do was, rather than have each language have only, they're all there in all of them. So, because, there's people in England who read Spanish perfectly well, or French, or German. So why shouldn't you be able to access and know what those sources are, right? And same with all the other languages. So, anyway, it's, as you probably have guessed, it's available in the 3 official languages of the order. And it includes the handy table of contents where you can click and it'll magically take you to that part of the document, which is always a great thing. The introduction of the preface, which Sebastian wrote, or the original is in French, obviously, gives a little bit about the history of how it emerged. So just to, a number of you probably already know this, but back in the gathering in Fatima in 2018 of the Assembly for the Lay Dominicans there, Vivian Boland had recommended this. He was sort of the one who was charged with formation in the Curia at that time. And so, why shouldn't the laity have access to something like this? And so there was buy-in, and it was accepted at that assembly, and so that's when it started. The reason it's taken so long, they put a committee together, and then, of course, COVID. So that kind of threw a wrench in the works. And then there were a lot of sort of starts and stops. And then by the time I came on board 2 years ago, there was a sort of messy document with a lot of stuff that was color-coded, and so that had to be sort of worked on. And Sebastian was marvelous in helping, together with others who worked with him. And then we collaborated in redactional things and whatnot. And so there you have it, and that's kind of how it happened. But he explains a little bit about this in the avant-propos. And of course the bibliography, which is longer than this, but this is just 2 of the pages of it. So, and finally, so one of the things when I started 2 years ago was there are many websites, obviously, and that's good, in different provinces for the Dominican laity, but there was nothing sort of global that everybody in the 3 languages that could be accessed, again, just for enrichment purposes and so forth. And I also wanted to have something that was somewhat visually appealing, to some extent, because sometimes you find websites that were put together many years ago, and they have a lot of wonderful resources. But unfortunately, it's like logging into a computer when it was DOS or something. Like with green numbers and letters going across this. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but so anyway, with the help of the communications office at Santa Sabina, who handled it, obviously, because I don't know how to do the technical side, we came up with LaiChOP, and again, you can access it in either English, Spanish, or French, and it has everything from countless PDFs and things that can be downloaded for free. It also has, and it's a work in progress, so even though it's up, it's a work in progress. So I'm trying to have video content, but that's still more limited than I would like. But I don't want to just put everything Dominican that's out there and put it up there because they're not all of equal quality. So what I'm doing is basically, I'm including not just video content, but also links to formation programs for lay people that are within the order. So for example, I try as much as possible whatever is free. If it's something that requires, like any normal formation program that you pay a tuition, I include some of those as well, but they would be things that are, again, I try to include things that are from the order. So Domuni Universitas, or something like that. But also, if they have virtual courses, especially, so that way, if there's a virtual course in English, no matter what part of the world you're in, you can sign up for it, So that sort of content. And of course, I try to have it in the 3 languages. So, and of course, I love that slide. I always stick it at the end of any presentation I do. I think it's adorable. So, there you go. And that's it. I can't think of anything else. I don't know if anyone has any questions or any that they would like to bring up.
So, thank you so much, Father Cristóbal. It's fantastic. Amazing. In terms of questions, what we're going to do is have a tea and a coffee break first and give you the chance then to chat with each other informally.